What's up, designers? Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to put some of our designs to work. All right, we just spent a whole bunch of time sitting in the studio producing these cut paper sketches, and you should have a folder somewhere either on your desktop or maybe it's saved to your Google portfolio just full of these things. Now this is going to be sort of a great inventory of designs to work with throughout the semester. Hopefully you've got some stuff in here that you're kind of sort of interested in. I know not everything you produced is going to be is gold or anything, but there should be, some nuggets of ideas in here. And what we're going to do today is get them back into Illustrator, dip our toe back into this kind of overly complicated program, and figure out a good way to transform our designs from the cut paper to the photograph back to vector. Now, the first time we did this in Illustrator, we were working with sort of a little extension of the program called Image Trace. We did this thing where we jumped up into Window, opened up the Image Trace palette. Honestly, it just didn't work very well for us. It's slow. The resolution of the images is at best kind of sketchy and suspect, right? Even if you can get a somewhat decent threshold scan of the image, when I get in really, really close on these, it looks like, oh yeah, like I've lost all my nice sharp corners. And even if I can get something like a halfway decent corner, corners and radiuses and things like that, generally whenever I work with images that have been image traced, I have way too many anchor points, and then I've got all this other stuff to deal with, like blobs in the corners, and it's traced white space and the black space. Just kind of a headache, right? Now, these nice smooth curves I should be able to get in just a few anchor points and without all the kind of headache of the sort of laggy scans. So for the sake of what we're going to be working with, let's just sort of forget the whole image trace, vector trace part of this program and kind of flex some of our design skills. We're going to work with the pen tool, what you might call the bezier tool, or the anchor point tool. It's going to allow us to sort of drop individual nodes or points, what Illustrator calls anchor points, and create complex polygons and things like that. And it will also allow us to start to use custom vector curves to really start to smooth out some of our designs. This is probably one of the more frustrating tools to get kind of get your head around when you first start working in Illustrator. So if you hit a wall with it, don't worry, you're in good company. This is a frustrating tool to master. What I'm going to do first, though, before we dip into the tool, is just cover some of those Illustrator basics so that you guys can kind of have your program set up more or less like mine. Right now, I've got a lot of pictures loaded into mine, which is mostly for demonstration purposes. I want to show you a bunch of different ways of approaching the design tracing process. When it comes down to actually turning stuff in, though, don't worry, you only owe me two, one geometric and one organic. When you launch Illustrator for the first time, you're going to get a window that looks something more like this. We're going to go File, New. And in your File New, or what happens when you click Create New, is you've got a few options to select here. Up along the top, we're going to be exporting to print, but Illustrator has the power and functionality to export to a whole bunch of different mediums. Since we're exporting to print, most of the paper we have access to is 8.5 by 11 inches. So I'm going to set my units to inches. That way all my measurements and things look about right. When I click Create, what I get is a giant white space. I'm going to do a Command minus here and zoom out. Giant white space around a small white document. This white document is my 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. Anything that goes into that document is considered in the artboard. So what do I do with all this extra white space? Well, here's a good example of what I do with all that extra white space. I have a lot of extra stuff I'm working on, right? We're going to end up kind of doing similar designs where you guys are going to bring in a lot of extra stuff, work with it, and then turn in only your final designs. Now, if your white space isn't white, but it's sort of a gray, come up here to Illustrator, Preferences, User Interface. Or if you don't have that functionality, do a Command K or Control K and click User Interface down here on the left-hand side. With your canvas color set to white, it'll look more like my demonstrations. Now, I know that you can kind of change the overall brightness or the look and feel of your Illustrator frames. I'll usually just be using this darker one because I tend to work in darker spaces and it's a little bit easier on the eyes. You're totally welcome to modify up there, and there's a lot of other really great sort of custom functionality built into this. You get to personalize your experience in Illustrator, but just so that you guys have Illustrator looking sort of like mine, check white. And this way you'll match my tutorials. Over here on the left, I have sort of a really dense toolbar. Mine is sort of expanded to be this double width here. Use these little double arrows on the side to make that happen. And underneath window, I make sure that my toolbars are set to advanced. If I'm on basic, I don't have quite as much functionality in here. Most of what you need would probably be in basic, but if you're ever wondering why Mr. Beck has more tools than you, it's because I may have the advanced toolbar showing. And then I also have my control bar exposed on top. If I go to window, control, that way I have control over things like my stroke and opacity, and it's just sort of always up there. Your control bar will change depending on what you're up to in Illustrator. Over here on the right hand side, I have a bunch of palettes that are going to look different than yours, but the one that you absolutely have to have open for this assignment is your layers palette. Keyboard shortcut for that is F7, or go to window, layers. Now you should have Illustrator more or less laid out like mine. I'm going to go to wherever I have my images saved and kind of find one that I'd like to work on. I just happen to have mine saved to my desktop, so I just have this folder open in Finder, and I should be able to just sort of drag and drop that image right into Illustrator. If you don't have drag and drop functionality, go to File, Place. And when you click that, you get this dialog window that opens up, and you can just go to wherever you have your files saved and include them one by one. Now, when Illustrator drops a photograph when you drop a photograph into Illustrator, it doesn't automatically link the file, or it doesn't automatically embed it into the document. And so, if I ever move this folder, or if I ever delete, the files from it, I'll lose access to them in this Illustrator document. If you don't like that, if you would like to embed it right into Illustrator, you should be able to click Embed right up in your control bar, and that way that photograph will stick with the document no matter where it goes, whether it's emailed to a different computer or uploaded to Drive. The only the only kind of caution I have there is every time you add a photograph to a file, it increases the size of that file, and if they're really big pictures, it increases the file quite a bit. Now, for the sake of just kind of not chewing up all of my workspace here, I'm going to shrink down the photograph and make it more or less the size of the piece of paper. Now, to do that, I was using one of my two main selection tools. The selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, is black, and the direct selection tool, keyboard shortcut A, is white. I'm going to use the black arrow and hover over the corner of my picture to get sort of a diagonal arrow key, and I should be able to start to shrink my picture down. Now, I don't want to distort the image or warp it really badly, so Command-Z, edit, undo that, and as I shrink this down, I'm going to hold Shift. Holding Shift maintains the proportions so that my original design stays put. Command +++, I'll zoom back in on that, and I want to perform sort of a basic tracing on this design, and to do that I want to turn down the opacity so that my tracing marks show up really clear. Once I'm selected on the photograph, I'll go to opacity up here in my options bar and duck the opacity down to somewhere in the 20% range or so. From here, I want to actually lock that layer. I'm going to come over to my layers palette and see that I've got a few pieces of functionality here. One of them is a little eyeball that allows me to hide or show the layer. One is a lock that allows me to lock that layer and prevents me from moving that picture around at all. And I can also rename that layer. Since I'm going to be putting all of my images in layer 1, I'm just going to outright name it images. That way it helps me sort of keep track of what I'm looking at. Now at the very bottom of your layers palette, there's a little piece of paper with the corner turned up. If I hover over it, it says Create New Layer. In this second layer, I'm going to do all of my tracings. By renaming these layers, I'm going to help keep track of them, because by the end of working with this project, we'll have probably 4 or 5 layers in there, and it's just helpful to know where specific things are located. Now I'm about at the same point as I was in this document here. 2 layers with image layers on the background, my tracing layers on top, and I am ready to get to work with the pen tool. Now if I want to trace out this design like I've got it going on here, I'll clear out my initial tracings, and I want to make sure that I don't have the accidental possibility of moving that background image around. So make sure that your image layers are locked. Now this background layer won't move around. And I'll use my direct select, or my main selection tool here, keyboard shortcut V, and just delete away my tracings and get to work with the pen tool. Now the pen tool doesn't work like a brush, right? It's not that kind of a pen tool. This is the sort of functionality you might expect out of a pen in your pocket, right? The pen tool is a vector tool, a vector anchor point tool, and it drops these nodes or anchor points at all of the kind of hard corners of your geometric shapes. We're going to start with a geometric design first because they're the easiest to kind of get the feel for the pen tool. Geometric lines are what the pen tool just sort of is automatically set to do, and all I'm doing is making one click at each corner. And as I come back to the point of origin, my pen tool gets a small circle next to it, and that circle is asking me, do I want to complete the shape? And once it's completed, I have an entire design. It doesn't really matter where you start, but once you begin, you see how Illustrator has this kind of line that sort of shows you about where it's going. It's probably just as easy just to focus all of your tracings onto the corners. Now my tracings are automatically set to look like these simple black lines, but yours may default to look something more like this, with a white fill and a very, very skinny black stroke. When Illustrator sort of thinks about, or when we talk about what's going on here in Illustrator, we have to kind of be really clear about what's going on inside of these shapes. These little corner points are anchors. The anchors are connected to paths on either side. If I want to grab a single anchor point, I need to select my direct select tool. The inside of these shapes is referred to as the fill, and in this shape I have no fill turned on, so it behaves kind of like a window. In this shape over here, my fill is set to white. It's kind of a bummer because I can't really see what I'm doing, so I'm going to come over to my toolbar over here on the left and switch the fill to none or null, the white box with the red line through it. It's also a little tricky for me to see that really skinny stroke, so I'll go up to my control bar and turn up the stroke a little bit so that I can more clearly see what's going on. Now, if I got a little lazy with my tracings and I didn't really hit the corners exactly the way they needed to be, I'll do a little zoom in, Command plus. I can put two fingers on the trackpad to sort of scroll around the inside of the document, or if you don't use a trackpad, you can hold spacebar, and spacebar sort of temporarily gives you access to the hand tool, which is also in your toolbar, and the hand tool allows you to sort of navigate around inside of your document. Once I can kind of see what's going on here with the edge of my paper and my actual design, I realize I need to move that corner point up. I'll switch keyboard shortcut A, switch to my direct select tool, grab just this one anchor point, and I should have the ability to sort of bump that around. Now I'll scroll down to the bottom of my document, and oh yeah, I've got another funky corner down here. I just need to reposition those. Getting in the habit of taking a close look at your designs is a really great way to make sure that your tracings are working out well. If I need to make adjustments to all of my shapes at once, I can kind of click and drag over them all using my selection tool. And in this case, I just wanted to set all the strokes to be the same weight because I was doing some adjustments and they got goofy. The geometric design that you're working on should go pretty quickly. Once it's traced, make a copy of it. I like the click and drag, so Option click and drag will allow me to just to sort of make a copy by pulling it straight over. That's the keyboard shortcut Option. Or I could just as easily select over the whole design, Command C, Command V, paste. The first design, I want this sort of wire-framed or stroke, black stroke, no fill. This second design, I would like you to flip that so that it has a black fill and no stroke. That's the first part of the design. Go ahead and spend some time tracing out your geometric shapes. If you got that down, and that's pretty easy, let's step up the challenge a little bit. Now the pen tool itself is an exciting tool to kind of get access to. It really kind of puts you in the driver's seat of generating your own vectors, but to kind of flex your skills a little bit, using the vector tool, using the pen tool to trace out curving lines is really the sort of big challenge here. So let's start with one of these more simplistic three-sided shapes and work our way up to some more of these complicated shapes with the pen tool, and then you'll actually really have to kind of just be put to work on your own designs and fine-tune your skills there. The pen tool traces out geometric lines automatically, But if I want to kind of trace out this nice smooth curve, the kind of thing I see a lot of initial designers try to do is just sort of make a bunch of pixel lines like it's some piece of Minecraft art or something like that. Stay away from that kind of designing. You're only going to get really jerky, kind of crunchy lines. What I want are these beautiful smooth lines. Actually, I should be able to get a nice smooth line, smoother even than the cuts I made in paper. Keyboard shortcut P, pen tool, and I'm going to come all the way down to the point down here, click and hold, and start to pull out the kind of curve, the Bezier curve of this design. And I was able to match that curve perfectly to the cut paper. Now Illustrator, because I've laid in a good curve here and I have handles pulling out on either end, sort of wants to kind of continue this funky curve, but I want to go more with a straight line. So I'll bring my pen tool back to my anchor point here, click off that curve, click and hold to finish the design, bend that line out, and with only 3 anchor points, I've got a fairly accurately traced sort of bending triangle or almost horn shape. Let's step up a little bit more of a complicated design here, and this design has 3 sort of hemispheres or 3 kind of half circle bends. I'll click and bend this curve down, click back to my original anchor, finish up that straight edge. Now these 2 shapes that I started with are good kind of introductory type of shapes to practice that pen tooling. But I don't really need to go back and modify the pen tool, modify those anchor points at all. These shapes are going to be more complicated. They're going to require some modifying, some kind of tweaking and bending. So let's start with this curve here. I would like to kind of make a curve that is as smooth as possible, almost like a perfect half circle, right? So I'll come all the way down to this opposite end and bend that curve out, and no, I just can't make it a perfect half circle curve. And so instead of trying to get it perfect, I'm just going to keep on tracing. Click back to this anchor here, and I'm not going to get this nice smooth curving S shape in one curve either. I'll come up to the top here just to see what I can get, right? I'll bend that curve out, but this line here totally doesn't look right to me. And now I'll come all the way back up to this design, and this is starting to get funky, right? That does not look like the shape that it's supposed to be. Click off this shape and just complete it. So this shape needs some edits. How do I get access to these little handles here to kind of go back and pull on them? Well, this tool, hiding underneath your pen tool, called the Anchor Point tool, Shift-C, will give you control over these anchor points and allow you to pull and modify them after the fact. Now usually 2 anchors or 2 handles will pull out and you're going to get super frustrated, so work with 2 hands now. Work with one hand on Command Z, which would be your edit undo controls. That way if you kind of make a big mistake and it gets hairy and messy, just kind of quick do a Command Z, back up 1 step or back up 2 steps. If I need to sort of reset my anchor points, I can click right on that anchor itself. If I want to send a handle back to its source to sort of make that line straight, I just click the handle once, and that takes care of it. If I want to click on, and sort of smooth a line that pulls straight through an anchor point, I can just sort of click that anchor and pull on it. Or in this case, I've got sort of this complicated S curve going on here, so I'm going to try to make that bend, and oh, what a mess. I think I'm going to have to add an anchor point down here to kind of make sure that I can create this S curve. Keyboard shortcut P, pen tool again, and notice as I hover over the path, I get a little plus sign next to the pen tool. I'm going to add an anchor point there. I'll use keyboard shortcut A to move that anchor point into position. A is the direct select tool and gives me control over those specific points. And now Shift-C, I'll get access to the anchor point tool. Now I can pull on these anchor points and try to more accurately bend them into position. Now the piece of paper that I was working with here was a little funky. It actually wasn't a perfectly smooth curve. It was a little messy. And so in my vector curves here, what I'll probably try to do is modify my curves and get them, see if I can't get them to clean up a little bit. So I will be as accurate as I can in tracing this, but knowing the whole while that if I turn off my tracings, I can see some real kind of choppy, messy cuts. My computer renderings, my computer tracings will actually smooth that out significantly. Mastering the pen tool is going to take you guys some practice. So get to work on your designs. Remember, at the end of this project, I'm only looking for two tracings. One that's got geometric, straight-edged shapes, and one that has curving shapes. We've got a bunch of other stuff to sort of talk about here. The anchor point and bezier bends are the sort of beginning, but working with shape tools, Pathfinder and Align palette, compound paths, shape building tools, there's a lot more to work with here in Illustrator, but we're going to save that for another day. Guys, I will catch up with you in the studio.